Imagine yourself in a world long before cities, long before even the thought of writing or history, a world where the sky stretched endlessly above and the earth lay silent beneath carpets of frost, a time when human footsteps were soft and uncertain, yet filled with wonder, and beside those fragile steps walked giants, the mammoths, shaggy and immense, their tusks curling like crescents of the moon, their breath steaming in the air like little clouds that joined the endless mists of the Ice Age. And as you walk beside them, your senses quiet, you notice how the earth seems to hum with their weight, how the ground vibrates ever so faintly, as though the planet itself recognizes their presence. And you too become part of that rhythm, part of that ancient march beneath skies so wide and endless that they seem to swallow the horizon. Skies that shift from glowing blues to burning oranges to star-scattered blackness. Each moment a reminder that life, even in its coldest age, carried beauty beyond measure. The air is crisp. Every breath feels both sharp and cleansing. And in that air, you can smell the faint musk of animals, the distant smoke of a fire tended by people not so different from you, though they dress in furs and skins and speak in sounds that carry more feeling than words. Yet you understand them, because here, communication is not made of language, but of glances, of gestures, of shared silence. And as the mammoths move slowly across the frozen grasslands, you see how humans and giants alike navigate survival, together and apart, sometimes hunters, sometimes companions, always bound by the same stars overhead. And you realize that this was not a world of isolation, but of deep connection, where every creature left a trace upon the land, and every trace carried meaning. A track in the snow, a curl of smoke, a cluster of stars that seemed to tell stories even when no voice spoke. And as you follow this ancient caravan, you find yourself drifting into the rhythm of their lives, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, until the boundaries between your time and theirs begin to dissolve. And all that remains is the sense of walking, of being, of belonging to a world where the giants still roam. To walk beside mammoths beneath the endless skies of the Ice Age was to step into a world that feels at once impossibly distant and strangely familiar. A world where silence was never empty, but filled with the hum of wind over frozen plains, the creak of ice shifting under its own ancient weight, the distant calls of animals whose shapes are remembered only in stone carvings and whispers of legend, and most of all, the steady rhythm of giants moving slowly across the land, creatures larger than any living today, wrapped in thick coats of fur, their tusks spiraling like ivory moons, carrying the memory of thousands of winters in every step. And as you walk alongside them, your body wrapped in fur stitched by careful hands, you feel not only the cold air pressing against your skin, but also the warmth of life itself, the shared struggle that bound human and beast in the same survival. And in this strange harmony, you realize that survival here was never only about strength. It was about listening, watching, and flowing with the rhythms of the land, the kind of patience that comes only when nights last longer than days, when food is found not in abundance, but in persistence, and when the fire you carry is more precious than gold, for the fire is not only light and heat, but memory, a torch handed down from one evening to the next, from one generation to another, glowing like a heartbeat against the darkness of the Ice Age. And as you breathe in the icy air, you notice how the mammoths breathe with you, clouds of steam rising, like prayers into the open sky, their slow movements stirring the snow, their shadows stretching endlessly beneath the stars. And in their presence, you do not feel fear, but calm, a recognition that they too are part of this fragile balance, that their size, their strength, their very being makes them less a threat and more a reminder of the immensity of the world. And as you look upward, you see the stars brighter than you have ever known them, blazing in constellations that future humans will name, but which now are simply silent witnesses, guiding lights across a frozen horizon. And you walk until your feet ache, but you do not notice the ache, because you are entranced by the rhythm of the giants. By the way, their every step seems to echo across the earth and into your very chest. And in those echoes, You hear stories not spoken, but lived. Stories of migration, of hunger, of survival, of kinship. Stories written not in words, but in footsteps pressed into the snow. And as you drift deeper into this world, you imagine the people who first walked here, their children laughing softly near the fire, their hunters moving quietly with spears, tipped in stone, their singers humming into the night to keep fear at bay. And though their voices are gone, their presence lingers in the quiet of the land, reminding you that you are not just an observer, but a participant in this ancient dream. And so the march continues, mammoths swaying gently, the wind carrying flakes of snow like feathers, the sky stretching out like an endless canvas, and you, a single figure wrapped in fur and wonder, walking beside giants, learning what it meant to be human, not through conquest, but through belonging, not through domination, but through coexistence, until the rhythm of their steps becomes the rhythm of your heart, steady, timeless, carrying you deeper into rest, deeper into calm, deeper into the memory of a world where to walk beside a mammoth was to walk beside the earth itself. To walk beside mammoths beneath the endless skies of the Ice Age was to walk in the company of giants. Giants not only of flesh and bone, but of memory and myth. Creatures whose very presence made the earth tremble softly, whose heavy steps echoed like drums of time itself. And as you gazed upon them, shaggy and immense, their tusks curling like ivory crescents, you felt the truth of what it meant to live in an age of giants, where size was not merely spectacle, but survival, where strength was sculpted by the frozen, winds and endurance was written into every fiber of fur. And so the giants moved, slowly, steadily, their silhouettes dark against the pale expanse of snow, their breath rising in clouds that joined the winter sky. And you, a fragile human wrapped in furs, found yourself dwarfed yet comforted. For to walk with giants was to be reminded that life had scale beyond comprehension. And yet within that immensity, you too had a place, a rhythm, a heartbeat that joined theirs. And as the giants swayed across the tundra, you realized that giants were not only mammoths, but the glaciers towering in the distance, glittering walls of frozen time, themselves giants of water and ice, ancient and unstoppable, moving inch by inch as slowly as the stars, reshaping the world without hurry, and overhead stretched the sky itself, a giant without boundaries, spilling, with stars so sharp and bright that they seemed to pierce the night, each one another giant flame burning across unimaginable distance. And you could not help but wonder how small you were, yet how precious, walking under giants, walking beside giants, walking among giants that defined the world. In this land of endless cold, even silence became a giant, vast and heavy, pressing against your ears until the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath your feet and the thunder of mammoth steps like a living drumbeat, steady, eternal, carrying you deeper into the rhythm of survival. And as you moved forward, you remembered that there were other giants too, the cave lions with their hulking shadows, the towering bison whose horns curved like half-moons, the saber-toothed cats whose teeth gleamed like daggers of bone, all giants of their own realm, each one a reminder that in this age, life was written on a scale so vast, so grand, that every breath felt both fragile and infinite. And so as you walked beside the mammoths, you whispered to yourself the word giant, again and again, giant, 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 until it became not a description, but a song, a chant carried by the wind, a lullaby, of immensity that soothed rather than frightened. For though you were small, you belonged in the shadow of giants. You carried their memory in your bones, their rhythm in your steps, and their calm endurance in your breath. And as the night deepened, the fire in the distance flickered softly, a tiny glow beneath the sky. Giant above, and you closed your eyes, knowing that to walk beside mammoths was not only to witness giants, but to dream with them, to rest within their world, to find peace in the immensity of the age of giants. To live in the Ice Age was to live surrounded by giants, and as the second night falls across the frozen plains, you walk ground gives way beneath their weight. Those air bends around their steaming massive shoulders rise higher, and as you breathe with them, You realize that survival here is not just about starlight like curved crescents, but about learning to walk with giants. And each step giants whose patience teaches you the rhythm of the land. Listens to giants. Giants whose slow migration shows you the meaning of endurance. And around you, the world itself seems filled only with giants. Glaciers loom like mountain walls of frozen water, slow-moving, unstoppable, their creaking voices whispering through the valleys, and above them, the sky stretches, an even greater giant, infinite, endless, scattered with icy stars. Some so bright they reflect off the snow like beads of fire, and you feel yourself small beneath these immeasurable guardians. Yet you also feel held by them, wrapped in their immensity, as though being small is not weakness but belonging. The predators, too, are giants in their own right. The cave bear whose lumbering frame shakes the underbrush, the saber-toothed cat whose fangs shine like blades of ice, the cave lion whose roar is deep enough to echo against stone. And even though they may hunt, even though danger is real, you understand that they too are part of this vast harmony of giants. Each creature etched into the grand design of survival. When the wind rises, it comes as another giant, sweeping across the tundra with a howl that rattles the trees and bends the grass. A giant voice that sings in the ears of those who listen, reminding them that in this land nothing is small, nothing is fleeting. Everything carries weight, everything belongs to something larger, and even your own fire, crackling at the camp's center, feels like a giant flame, fragile yet powerful, a flicker against darkness that binds families together, its smoke climbing like a giant column toward the night sky. In moments of quiet, you look upward and see the constellations, giant patterns traced across eternity, not yet named, but already alive in imagination. And perhaps your ancestors once whispered stories of those sky giants, seeing in them mammoths, and lions and spirits watching from above. And perhaps you too, beneath their endless gaze, find comfort in their stillness. To walk here is to repeat the word giant with every step. Giant in the snow beneath your feet, giant in the wind upon your face, giant in the eyes of the animals who move around you, giant in the endless stars that guard your dreams, giant in the very silence that surrounds you. For even silence is not empty but heavy, vast, a giant presence filling your ears until the only sound that matters is your own heartbeat, steady, strong, echoing in rhythm with the mammoths. Giant, 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 until you no longer feel separate from them, until you become part of their slow march, until your breath itself joins theirs in a chorus of living giants. And as you close your eyes beneath the vast sky, you drift into dreams where giants walk without end. Giants who teach you that size is not terror but majesty, not fear but calm. And in their presence you find peace, because in the age of giants, even your smallness feels infinite. Imagine a world where everything felt immense, where every horizon seemed endless, and every creature that moved across the land carried the weight of prehistory in its stride. For this was the Ice Age, an era not of small things, but of giants, where mammoths with tusks curling like white crescents against the grey sky shook the frozen ground with each ponderous step, where woolly rhinoceroses pushed their heavy forms through snow-laden valleys, where giant ground sloths rose like walking boulders among trees, where saber-toothed cats with fangs like carved ivory lay in ambush, where bison herds so vast they seemed to darken entire plains, moved like rivers of muscle and breath. And against this backdrop of enormity stood small bands of humans whose courage was no less giant than the beasts they hunted, whose minds carried the weight of generations, whose fires glowed defiantly against the encroaching cold. Proof that though their bodies were fragile, their imaginations stretched as wide as the skies above. Picture them walking across tundra that itself felt giant, rolling white expanses broken only by the silhouettes of frozen forests, their footsteps small yet persistent. Children wrapped in hides, hunters carrying spears tipped with stone, women carrying embers in shells or gourds to spark the next fire, their voices whispering in the wind as if adding another note to the eternal song of the ice. And yet, within this immensity, humans carved meaning. For every track of mammoth in snow was a message to be read, every migration of reindeer a map traced in memory, every gust of wind across glaciers a lesson in endurance. And so knowledge itself became giant, swelling in the minds of those who survived, passed down in stories told by firelight, where giants were not only beasts of flesh, but spirits of land and sky, protectors and teachers, and sometimes warnings of hubris. Imagine sitting by one of those fires, the flames reflecting in eyes tired from the hunt, voices chanting softly, telling of mammoths as guardians of valleys, of saber-toothed cats as shadows of night, of thunder as the footsteps of unseen beings. Stories that wrapped fear in reverence and turned survival into meaning. Stories that were giant in their power to bind a group together across endless winters. Now see them moving with patience across frozen rivers, their silhouettes dwarfed by cliffs of ice, the air sharp with frost, wolves howling at a distance. And in this vastness, every human gesture felt enormous. The striking of flint against stone to spark fire, the careful shaping of spear points, the painting of animals on cave walls with ochre and charcoal, handprints pressed like signatures into stone, saying we are here, even if we are small, even if the world is filled with giants. Our memory too will endure, giant in its persistence. And here we begin to see that the true giant of the Ice Age was not mammoth or sloth or cat, but the unbroken endurance of human curiosity, the flame of thought that turned obstacles into paths, cold into challenge, and hunger into invention. For though the beasts were immense, it was the human spirit that reached further still, stretching beyond valleys, beyond mountains, beyond horizons, planting footsteps that would one day circle the earth. Imagine them walking beside a mammoth herd, not as equals, but as witnesses, watching the young calves press against their mothers, hearing the low rumble of their calls echoing across frozen plains, feeling the ground vibrate with their mass, and knowing that to hunt one was to challenge something almost sacred, requiring not only strength, but strategy, not only courage, but community. For no single hunter could bring down such a beast, but many together, with patience and precision, could turn the giant into sustenance that fed families, clothed children, armed hunters with tools carved from bone and tusk, tools that themselves would last longer than flesh, buried in permafrost to be discovered thousands of years later, whispers of survival echoing into our own age. And as the herds moved, so too did humans, trailing them through valleys and over ridges, across steppes that seemed to have no end. A partnership of predator and prey, written not in cruelty, but in necessity. A cycle as old as life itself, where every life taken was honored, every use of bone, hide, fat, and sinew, a reminder that nothing was wasted, and so survival became both practical and spiritual, a balance between taking and remembering, between hunger and gratitude. And in this balance, the human heart grew giant, capable of reverence even in the act of killing, of awe even in the act of enduring. Nights stretched long in these lands, the stars wheeling like frozen fires above, constellations brighter than in our own age, and humans lay wrapped in hides, listening to the crackle of flames, tracing shapes in the sky, weaving stories into patterns that would outlast them. Stories of hunters who walked with mammoths, of ancestors who crossed frozen bridges, of spirits that lived in rivers and mountains. And in these stories, time itself became giant, stretching backward and forward, tying one generation to the next in a chain of memory that could never be broken. Picture caves glowing with torchlight as hands painted scenes of hunts, of mammoths encircled by human figures, of bison collapsing under spears, of abstract spirals and dots whose meanings are lost, but whose presence still speaks. And know that, in these acts of creation, humans were carving themselves into eternity, declaring in silence that they too were giants, not in size but in meaning, not in strength but in memory. And so this chapter closes not with the image of beasts alone, but with the vision of humanity walking among them, small yet immense, fragile yet enduring, whispering songs into the cold wind, pressing footsteps into snow, carrying fire across frozen rivers, and standing always beneath the endless skies of the Ice Age. A people among giants, yet giants themselves in spirit, carrying forward the unbroken flame of survival, imagination, and hope. Above the frozen earth stretched skies so vast they seemed without end. Skies that carried clouds like drifting mountains. Skies that deepened to an infinity of stars when the long nights descended. Skies that were not simply backgrounds, but living companions, maps, calendars, and silent teachers of early humanity. For to walk beneath such immensity was to feel both small and giant at once, fragile against the cold, yet connected to something endless. And beneath these skies flowed rivers of equal grandeur, rivers swollen with the melt of glaciers, rivers that carved valleys deeper than any human could imagine, rivers that thundered with the voices of giants themselves, carrying icebergs in their currents. For here was both danger and promise, both obstacle and guide, a giant force that could drown or sustain, that could feed fish into waiting nets woven from fibers, that could carry canoes carved from hollow logs, that could provide pathways deeper into the land. And around these rivers, humans began to build their memory. For every bend in the current, every valley where the water slowed, every crossing where stones broke, the flow became etched into their minds as maps, as stories told. Again and again, until rivers themselves became teachers as much as they were resources. And yet it was the sky above that gave the truest measure of vastness. For when the fires dimmed and silence settled, humans looked upward into constellations so sharp and bright they seemed close enough to touch. Stars not blurred by smoke or light but piercing, infinite, eternal. And in them, patterns emerged. Hunters traced animals across the heavens, just as they did on cave walls. Wolves and mammoths and deer sketched in points of light, rivers of stars flowing like echoes of the waters below. And thus the giant sky became another map, another guide, teaching seasons, migrations, times of birth and times of hunger, anchoring memory not only in earth, but in the vault of heaven itself. Imagine lying on hides at night, listening to the low rumble of mammoths in the distance, the crackle of fire fading as embers glowed red, children pointing to stars as parents whispered stories of ancestors who had walked across lands now frozen, of spirits who lit the heavens with their fires, of paths traced in constellations that could lead the lost home again, stories that made the sky not empty but filled with presence, a ceiling of memory and imagination so giant it held all of humanity's hopes. And so rivers and skies intertwined in the human mind, one flowing across land, the other across time, one carrying fish and ice, the other carrying myths and directions. And in this duality, humans found both sustenance and meaning, for they could drink from rivers, they could fish and cross and follow them, but from the sky they drank something deeper, a nourishment of spirit, a reminder that even though they were small beneath immensity, they belonged to it. They were woven into the same fabric as stars and currents, as winds and rains. See them now, setting snares along riverbanks where reeds swayed in the cold breeze. Hear the splash of fish caught in woven traps. Watch hunters flake stone into points by the water's edge. Hear the soft songs of women grinding seeds between stones, their voices carrying upward into the sky as if speaking to the stars themselves. And around them the land waits, giant in its silence, the forests pressing dark at the edges, the glaciers gleaming in the distance, the sky slowly turning, the river endlessly flowing, time itself stretching long like the seasons. And within this flow, humans lived not in haste, but in rhythm, each act a note in the larger song of survival. And though the rivers could flood, tearing camps from their banks, though the skies could unleash storms that buried the land in snow, still humans endured. For with every season they learned more, carrying knowledge forward like embers, storing it in stories, embedding it in ritual, until even the dangers became part of their belonging. For to live in the Ice Age was to live with giants, not only of flesh, but of water and sky, of storm and star. And to adapt meant not to conquer, but to listen, to remember, to adjust, to survive. Imagine crossing one of those rivers in winter, the ice groaning beneath footsteps, the sound echoing across the valley, each step a risk, each success a triumph. The knowledge of where the ice was thick passed down like sacred wisdom. For one, mistake could take life, but memory could save it, and such knowledge too was giant, heavy with consequence, precious as fire, and so every crossing was a ritual, every success a victory of mind over chance. And when storms raged and the sky turned white with snow, humans huddled in shelters of hide and bone, their fires glowing against the storm, voices chanting, singing, telling stories not to pass the time, but to keep memory alive, to bind the group together against the vast indifference outside. And here we see again that the greatest giant was not river or sky, but the human bond, the circle of firelight, the voice that carried knowledge across generations, so that even in the silence of endless snow, meaning endured, hope endured, memory endured. Thus, Chapter 4 closes with the image of figures standing at the edge of a river under a sky alive with stars, their silhouettes dark against the glow of fire, their faces lifted upward as if to measure their place between earth and heaven, between current and constellation. And in that moment, they were both small and immeasurable, fragile in body, yet giant in spirit, carrying within them the fire that mirrored the stars above, a fire that promised survival, memory, and the unbroken journey forward. Step now from the riverbanks and out from the open sky into the vast domain of the Ice Age forests, where trees rose like pillars holding the heavens, where endless stretches of pine, spruce, and birch swayed beneath winds sharp with frost, where shadows stretched long and cool even at midday, and where the silence of snow muffled every sound until the crack of a branch or the cry of a distant wolf seemed enormous, echoing across the stillness like a drumbeat. And here among these giants, humanity learned another rhythm of life, for forests were both sanctuary and labyrinth, places of danger and places of shelter, places where one could find fuel for fire, wood for tools, bark for binding, resin for healing, mushrooms for eating, berries for sweetness, but also places where predators stalked unseen, where the darkness could close in, where every path could lead deeper into confusion. And so to walk the forests was to walk with caution, with memory, with eyes sharp and ears listening to every flutter of wings overhead or scuttle in the underbrush. Yet for early humans, these forests were also teachers. For every tree carried knowledge if you knew how to read it. The curve of a trunk showing the direction of prevailing winds, the moss along the bark pointing north, the scars of claw marks telling of bears, the hollow calls of birds signaling both food and the approach of danger. And in this way, the forest was a living book, and humanity its reader, writing notes, with footsteps, etching stories in memory, passing them down around fires where wood from the same trees blazed into sparks that rose upward, as if returning to the canopy from which they had come. Imagine the hunters pressing through snow-draped branches, spears balanced in hand, mammoth tracks pressed deep into the earth, their breath clouding the cold air, listening, always listening, for the groan of bison or the snap of a twig that might reveal prey or predator, while nearby gatherers crouched beside roots, digging with sticks, searching for edible bulbs hidden in frozen ground, their fingers numb but their minds alive with the knowledge carried from ancestors, the memory of what plants healed, what poisoned, what nourished, what killed. And all of it was learned here in the shadow of trees that had stood for centuries before any human walked beneath them. And so the forest became more than resource. It became home, and to sleep beneath the boughs was to feel both enclosed and protected, as if the world itself had lowered its ceiling of branches to cradle the fragile flame of human life. Yet even in safety, the awareness of giants never faded, for in the dark came the eyes of cave lions, the slink of saber-tooths, the long haunting howl of wolves, predators, as much part of the forest as the roots themselves, and humans knew they were never alone here, but still they endured, making shelters from fallen trunks, weaving hides into roofs, leaning branches together into domes that resisted the wind, all while fires crackled at the center, a second sun glowing beneath the canopy, a promise that the cold could not conquer completely. And with each passing season, the knowledge deepened. The relationship with trees grew stronger, for wood gave warmth. Wood gave tools. Wood gave weapons. Wood gave sound in the form of drums. Wood gave spirit in the form of carved figures. Wood gave memory in carvings etched into bark. And so it is no exaggeration to say that the forest was as necessary to survival as the river, as the sky, as fire itself. Picture children playing in the snow at the edges of camp, climbing among roots that twisted above ground like frozen serpents, sliding down slopes where pine needles carpeted the earth, their laughter rising into the cold air while elders watched, telling them stories of spirits who lived within the trees, spirits that must be respected, that must never be angered, for each giant tree was believed to hold a presence, a breath, a being that listened, that watched. And in this belief, humans treated the forest not as inert, but alive, alive with voices, alive with memories, alive with giants who stood silent yet eternal. And whether or not these spirits were imagined, the reverence they inspired ensured balance, ensured survival, ensured that the forest was never stripped completely, but always approached with care, with ritual, with thanks. Imagine too the way the forest sounded at night. The wind moving through branches like the roar of distant oceans. Owls calling in hollow voices, the crack of frost splitting bark, the crunch of snow under the slow tread of something unseen, and then the answering whisper of human voices around a fire, soft chants rising into smoke, words that bound fear into rhythm, that calmed restless children, that reminded the group of who they were and why they belonged here. And in that chant, the forest itself seemed to listen, seemed to sway in time, something vast yet sheltering, something giant yet familiar. And so the forests of the Ice Age were not only survival grounds, they were cradles of imagination, of story, of myth, of song. And when you think of those people moving through the shadows, carrying torches, following tracks, teaching children, carving wood, weaving branches into homes, gathering resin, and listening to wolves howl in the distance, you see not just survival but meaning, not just endurance but reverence, not just fear but belonging. For the giant forests were both danger and sanctuary, both shadow and light, and in their depths, humans grew not only stronger but wiser, weaving themselves into the rhythm of roots and leaves, rivers and skies, fire and snow. And in that weaving, the forest and humanity became one. Imagine now the sight of the glaciers, vast rivers of frozen time, walls of white and blue stretching farther than the eye could see, towers of ice rising like mountains carved not by stone, but by centuries of snowfall pressed into shimmering mass, moving so slowly that no single life could witness their journey, yet moving nonetheless, grinding valleys beneath their weight, shaping rivers, carving cliffs, sculpting the very bones of the earth. And into this frozen world humanity walked, fragile sparks of warmth moving at the edges of giants, their fires flickering against the immensity of ice that seemed eternal, unstoppable, a living force that breathed cold into the air and wind into the valleys. Picture men and women standing at the base of such a glacier, necks straining upward, eyes blinded by the gleam of sunlight scattering across the frozen surface, ears filled with the groan and crack of shifting ice, thunderous booms as chunks, larger than houses, split and fell into frozen seas, waves rippling outward with a violence that reminded all who saw it that here was no still monument but a giant alive, alive with motion, alive with power, alive with time itself. For the glaciers were keepers of centuries, holding within them the snow of ancestors, the dust of storms long past, the memory of worlds gone, and in their slow advance they told the story of the earth, indifferent to human lives, yet shaping every path those lives could take. To live near ice was to know hunger and challenge, for the land it swallowed gave little, yet from its melt came rivers that fed valleys. From its cold came protection against pests and plagues. From its silence came a lesson in endurance, and so humans did not simply fear the ice. They adapted to it. They watched its signs. They measured seasons by its growth and retreat. They carved shelters into frozen caves. They hunted along its edges, where mammoths and reindeer grazed on the brief green that sprang from thawing soil. They wore furs thick enough to guard against the winds that cut like knives across the open plains. And always they remembered the rules whispered by ancestors. For the ice was a giant to be respected, not challenged, not mocked, not ignored, but studied, listened to, endured. Imagine children pressed close to their mothers as blizzards howled outside, hearing the sharp snap of frozen trees breaking beneath the weight of snow, hearing the far-off roar of ice carving into the sea, learning early that this world was not soft, that survival meant patience, unity, fire, and memory. And yet those same children also laughed, sliding on frozen ponds, chasing each other across drifts. Their joy a defiance against the cold, a warmth that no glacier could erase. For the human heart burned brighter than ice, and in that contrast, giant cold and fragile warmth, life continued. And at night, when the skies above the glaciers shimmered with auroras, curtains of green and red flowing like rivers of light, humanity looked upward in awe, seeing in those lights not just beauty, but presence, spirits dancing, ancestors returning, messages written across the heavens. And with these visions, the ice was no longer only cold stone, but a temple, a hall of the giants, a place where earth, sky, and time met, where the smallness of human figures was balanced by the greatness of their spirit, their ability to see meaning even in silence, to hear voices even in wind, to find hope even in the endless white. Think of the journeys across frozen seas, hunters walking carefully over ice that creaked beneath their feet, dragging sleds loaded with hides and bones, their dogs barking against the cold, their breath freezing in the air, every step a risk, yet every step also a promise. For across the ice lay new lands, new hunting grounds, new survival, and so the ice was both obstacle and bridge, both threat and path. And in that duality, humanity found resilience, for they crossed not because it was safe, but because it was possible. And in choosing to walk the ice, they showed the same spirit that had carried them across rivers, through forests, beneath skies, the willingness to meet the giant, to walk with it, to adapt, to endure. And in this way, the glaciers of the Ice Age were not only forces of destruction, but of creation, shaping earth, shaping rivers, shaping the minds of those who lived beside them, teaching lessons of patience, of humility, of endurance, teaching that survival was not conquest but belonging, not domination but balance. And so those who lived with the ice carried within them a deep memory, a knowledge that they were part of something immense, something eternal, something giant that moved, with or without them, but within which they found their place, their path, their meaning. Stand now at the edge of the world where land dissolves into endless water, where the giant seas of the Ice Age stretch beyond the horizon, vast, dark, and cold, their surfaces sometimes frozen into jagged fields of ice, sometimes rolling with grey waves that seemed to carry the very weight of the sky. And here, humanity faced another giant, for the sea was not only vast, but unpredictable, a shifting boundary between known and unknown, between survival and oblivion, between the safety of the shore and the mystery of what lay beyond. Picture small bands of hunters and gatherers standing on cliffs of frozen rock, watching seals pull themselves onto the ice, whales breaching in the distance, seabirds wheeling in clouds above the waves, and know that for them, the sea was both larder and labyrinth, offering food in the form of fish, shellfish, seals, and seabirds, but demanding skill, memory, and bravery to take from it. For the tides shifted without warning, storms rose like sudden giants, and the cold itself could steal breath faster than any predator. Yet still they learned, still they adapted, still they carved boats from logs, lashed hides over frames of bone and wood, pushed themselves into waters that seemed intent on swallowing them, driven not by recklessness but by necessity, by hunger, by the promise that across these waters lay more land, more rivers, more forests, more life. And as they paddled across frozen bays, their faces stung by salt spray and wind, they watched the movement of stars overhead and learned to measure direction, to hold memory not just in stories of land, but in the rolling rhythm of waves, in the cycles of tides, in the voices of seabirds, so that the ocean itself became another teacher, another map, another giant whose presence shaped not only survival, but imagination. Imagine nights when they camped at the shore, fires blazing against the cold wind, listening to the roar of surf crashing endlessly, a rhythm as ancient as time itself, a heartbeat of the world that soothed even as it threatened. And in those nights they told stories of beings who lived beneath the waves, spirits larger than mammoths, serpents of the deep, ancestors who had walked into the sea and become whales, gods whose moods were tides, and through these stories the sea was given shape, meaning, memory, transformed from chaos into presence, from threat into relationship. And in that transformation, humanity endured. For the Ice Age seas were not static. They rose and fell with glaciers, opening bridges of land that allowed humans to walk where today there is only ocean, revealing paths between continents, connecting peoples across what seemed infinite divides. And those who crossed carried stories, tools, fire, memory, weaving human presence across the globe, so that the sea, giant and shifting, was both barrier and bridge, both silence and song, both ending and beginning, and in every wave that crashed against the shore was a reminder that nothing stood still, that even giants moved, that even the seemingly eternal was in motion, shaping and reshaping the world. And think of the children running at the edges of the tide, chasing waves as they rolled back, laughing as foam touched their feet, their joy unbroken by the cold, their voices rising into the wind, while elders watched with a mix of fear and pride, knowing that one day those same children would paddle into waters far more dangerous, would face storms, would risk lives, but also knowing that such risk was the price of belonging in a world shaped by giants, a world where rivers, forests, ice, and sea demanded not conquest, but courage, not arrogance, but respect, not passivity, but memory. And so the sea too became part of the rhythm of human survival, its roar another voice in the endless chorus of earth, sky, and fire, a voice that spoke of both danger and promise, both hunger and hope, both ending and continuation. And in its presence, humanity did not shrink, but grew, learned, adapted, carried forward the same fragile flame of life that had endured against mammoths, lions, and glaciers, carrying it now across the waves, across the giant seas of the ice age, into the future that would be ours. If the forest stood silent and the seas roared eternal, then the winds of the Ice Age were the restless spirits that moved between them all, giant forces without form, pressing ever onward beneath skies that stretched wider than mountains, beyond peaks yet unseen, into the next horizon of the endless human journey. Now, imagine stepping into the shadowed depths of the world's giant caves, hollowed by time, and water carved into cliffs, cliffs pressed against mountains, cliffs resting above rivers, where stone formed vast chambers and narrow tunnels, ceilings dripping with condensation, walls layered with mineral veins that shimmered in torchlight. And here humanity found sanctuary, a giant shelter against the cold, the wind, the storm, a place where survival and imagination met, where firelight flickered against stone and shadows danced like living beings. And within these walls, humans learned not only to endure but to transform, turning mere hollow rock into home, into canvas, into library. For the caves became repositories of memory, culture, and identity, a place where knowledge could outlast the fragile bodies that carried it across ice, tundra, and forest. Picture families huddled against the cold stone, children wrapped in furs, elders tending fires whose smoke spiraled towards ceilings slick with moisture, the glow painting faces with warmth that rivaled the sun. And in that warmth, stories grew, stories of hunts, of mammoths and predators, of journeys across ice and sea, of ancestors who had walked farther and braved more than imagination alone could contain. Each story a thread weaving generations into the fabric of survival. Each word a shield against forgetting. For memory was the weapon as vital as spear or bow. And in this way, the caves became a sacred space, a giant library not of paper or ink, but of breath, song, and gesture, preserving knowledge for those yet to walk the world. And imagine the walls themselves, not merely stone, but canvases, where ochre, charcoal, and clay created figures of beasts, swirling spirals, handprints, abstract signs whose meaning carried across millennia, a dialogue between human and stone, between imagination and survival, between presence and permanence, for each mark declared existence.